Hello, and welcome to the Emissaries of the Gospel podcast. My name is Jeremy Brown. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about racism, kinism, slavery, accusations of people talking about blood and soil, at least in a way similar to the way the Nazis did, and that kind of thing. A lot of reckless insinuations and accusations going around. So, thought I would talk about that. I'm going to share a clip with you and some other information, share some scripture with you. And before I do that, wanted to make sure to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. That is incredibly helpful to us, as is clicking on that bell icon for notifications. That's part of the way that we are seeking to support our evangelistic ministry, as well as improving the production values on this channel. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us, we're also going to have a link in the comments section for that. But definitely, it doesn't cost you anything to subscribe and to click that bell icon for notifications. So that way, if we're a blessing, please make sure to share this around. That being said, I wanted to go into a video that was recently done. This was an interview that Joel Webbon of Right Response Ministries did with Jonathan Harris, who he has the podcast Conversations That Matter. He's written a number of different books, including ones like Social Justice Goes to Church. He is part of Truth Script, and so he's definitely someone that I've come to appreciate, even though I don't agree with Jonathan Harris on everything, nor do I agree with Joel or pretty much anyone else on absolutely everything. But I've found he has been a very thoughtful voice. He does his research. He's well spoken, and generally speaking, I think the majority of his conclusions are correct. So I thought this was a thoughtful discussion. I'm only going to get into part of it, but I wanted to show you a little bit of this. So let's go to the video.
There is a sheepishness about our past, not just what the Bible says. Of course, there's the sheepishness about that. The Bible, of course, in the Old Testament, there's a slavery system that's regulated by God, in which there's even elements of it that are perpetual. People like to, when they go back and defend the Bible, they want to make it out like that wasn't real slavery because, look, you couldn't keep a Hebrew slave perpetually. But, look at the laws concerning pagan slaves. You could. And there's a lot.
All right. We're actually, why don't I get into it right now? Regarding the pagan slaves, I thought I might do this a little bit later, but now I want to do it right now. But before I do, I want to mention, so Jonathan Harris is basically talking about the church wearing kid gloves and tiptoeing around and being apologetic because of some type of shame about our past. And even though we have sin in our past, that some of it's egregious, and quite frankly, every people group and nation does, that we've also bought into a massive narrative that is really not true. It is at best a half truth, and so it's a lie. But what I wanted to do before I get into more of that, just keep that in mind. Wanted to talk a little bit about the slavery in the Old Testament, right? So he did mention, if you had a Hebrew slave, that was a voluntary system, unless they somehow stole from or defrauded you, and you couldn't come to terms with them, and so they had to, go into debt slavery, like indentured servitude type of arrangement, right? There was a lot of rules around that. You had to release them after they had served you 6 years. So in the 7th year, they had to be released. You had to furnish them liberally. That's from your wine press, your flock, and your threshing floor, right? These men would have learned a skill, would have learned a lot of disciplines and whatnot, and they had to be paid 50% of the normal wage. So they didn't work for free. The scripture actually shows that they could have become wealthy. In fact, that is exactly what Jacob did. Jacob was a slave of Laban's for a period of time, and Jacob became wealthy. Right now, you could become wealthy and actually buy yourself out of slavery. So if you didn't want to be enslaved through 6 years and released in the seventh, and you were becoming wealthy, you could buy yourself out. Somebody else could redeem you also. And there was a heavy expectation on Israelites to redeem their kinsmen, right? To not allow them to be in slavery. But the whole purpose of it was to make sure, okay, there's a person who was either robbed or defrauded, or there was a debt that somebody did not pay. And even though they have the opportunity to forgive whatever loan or debt, they're not necessarily obligated to, and they might not be able to afford to, in the sense that, you know, in many cases, what was happening is these men were being given 3.5 years worth of wages, right? So if you think about that, if you think about the like what we might consider a living wage now, this is not going to be perfect because our society actually has a much less just system regarding work and paying people. The laborer is worthy of his wages. The idea would be there's a livable wage. You were obligated to pay a man who's working for you commensurate with what a livable wage is, and if you're only going to hire him for part of the day, that part of the day has to be basically equivalent to, a day's wage or more. It could be more, but it should never be less. And, there were rules about paying people before the sun went down if they were poor because they needed it, and it would be oppression if you didn't. There was all kinds of things tied up in that, right? However, it was a voluntary system. A lot of times, like if a man wanted to have a wife, right, he had to give to her father an amount that would be a substantial security for her in case the man died, or whatever. Maybe he abandoned her or something, right? So if the father had to come back in and take over supporting his daughter, there was a compensation there for her and any children that they might have, right? So this wasn't like purchasing, the woman, right? People say that. That's kind of a silly way of putting it, especially when you're talking about it like, modern woke people, modern feminists and whatnot. You don't even want to go there because their whole mindset on the process is poison. But anyhow, so you had this system set up for the Hebrews, and you say, but what about the pagans that were amongst them, right? Jonathan Harris is bringing that up. And actually, the way he and Joel Webbon spoke in this interview, they never really got into something that I think is really important here, because there's a limitation that God puts on that type of slavery. So they were technically correct in part of what they said, but they just it could have been an oversight, or maybe they don't realize this, or they may have a disagreement with me on this, but there was part of it that they didn't mention. I'm going to read it because it's from Leviticus 25. I'm going to start in verse 44. It says, "As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you in their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property." Okay, so this is definitely not the regular chattel, the regular indentured servitude, but this is more like chattel slavery, right? To Jonathan Harris's point. It says, "You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly," right? So there we go, right? And so people will go and kind of clutch their pearls, so to speak, and think that, oh, this is it. This is where the Bible, endorses making perpetual slaves out of all unbelievers, or whatever foolishness they have. This is what the slave owners used. Well, some of them might have used this, right? But I'm going to go into why some of that was wrong, right? And I wish, because this was a pretty good interview, I wish that they would have mentioned this, right? So you heard the passage that I just read to you, and this is just showing you a map of, it says map of Israel's early inhabitants. So this is Israel, which previously had been the land of Canaan. This is the promised land that God gave to the Israelites. God, who owns this land, chose for them to be there, and he chose to displace and in some cases eliminate the inhabitants, right? And so you had basically 7 nations of tribes, right? This was where you have the Canaanites, the Jebusites, and the Hivites, and the Hittites, and so on and so forth, right? And so these people groups that were in there, number one, God says the land was vomiting them out. Well, why was that? Number one, they were sacrificing their children, their babies, to Molech, right? And God said that was wicked. They used to put them on this burning altar in the likeness of Molech, and when the babies would scream, they would just beat the drums really loud so they couldn't hear them. It's in many ways very much like modern abortion, right? They also were committing sodomy, right? And there were a number of other practices too, idolatry and sorcery, and all of these kind of things that they were doing. That it said the land was vomiting them out. God wanted them driven out. These were a people that opposed Israel. They opposed God. But there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up because it's only those nations that are around them. So it's only those 7 nations that they're allowed to have these perpetual slaves from. So God is not saying in Leviticus 25 that they could go to Egypt and make them slaves. He's not saying that they could go to Ethiopia. He's not saying that they could go up to Italy or Great Britain or over to India or China or any of these places, and whatever their names at the time may have been, right? He's not saying that they could go to these places and make them slaves. He was very specifically focusing on these 7 nations, these specific tribes. And one of them that I'll mention is the Rephaim, right? And the reason that I'm going to mention this is because these tribes, particularly those that were in the hill country, these were the giant tribes, right? So back in Genesis 6, you see that the sons of God, these were fallen angels, right? That they had, they took for them as wives the daughters of men, right? And when they had children, they were the Nephilim, right? The Nephilim were giants. The Nephilim were mighty men of renown, right? And one of those tribes of giants was the Rephaim. There were other ones, but basically these 7 nations around were where these giants were located, right? And so God is eliminating them. He's exterminating this hybrid demonic bloodline, right? Now, this isn't to say that God had issues with all the other bloodlines or whatever. And when you see this, so these nations were being driven out, they were being defeated and put to the sword, and in some cases, certain cities, there were certain people that God said, "Hey, destroy every last one of them." Right? Well, there's a good reason for it, right? Like if you see, oh, destroy all the men, but then also the women and also the children, you're like, oh wow, that seems really harsh. Well, if we had I don't know, orcs like from the Lord of the Rings, or you had aliens from outer space, which I believe are demons, by the way. But if you had some clearly non-human alien species that was creating a dangerous, wicked, vicious, brutal, bloodthirsty, perverse hybrid being to come and try to take over and rule, and they were corrupting the people, they were destroying the people, they were brutalizing the people, and this was happening over a long period of time too, right? You would God was very patient with them. You would go and destroy them, right? If you had any compassion or love for your fellow man whatsoever, you would go and destroy these beings because they are beyond just corrupt, right? They are pure evil, right? That's part of it, right? But also, like the people who were part of these tribes, it's not every single person that might have resided in this land would have had their DNA corrupted. They weren't all giants. They, They may have been pagans for sure, but they were being ruled over and lorded over. And when they were defeated, they could offer themselves up as slaves. Well, this was a twofold thing, right? Number one, it's showing, okay, you can't come in here and rule, and we're not going to let you continue those grotesque practices that you had before, right? Those have to be put a stop to. When you're sacrificing your babies to Molech, that has to completely stop, period, right? And so, and there were things like bestiality and all kinds of incest and all, like, it was just a wicked, horrible thing. They had no standard of justice there. Not really. They didn't have a real standard of justice. In fact, Israel's standard of justice, aka God's law, was meant to be an actual evangelistic tool to them, so they would see how righteous and just God's laws are, and how wise they are, and how near God is to his people, right? Anyhow, these people, when they came in, number one, they could become an Israelite, right? And once they became an Israelite, the rules dealing with Israelites and Israelite slaves would apply to them, right? The clock was ticking on how long they could be kept. But if they didn't want to abandon their false gods and so forth, they would be allowed to live there in peace and work there in peace, and they wouldn't be put to the sword. But they were not going to be allowed to go back out and reform these nations and all their practices and come back to seek to destroy God's people, right? And also not to lead them away, to lead them astray. So they were made a slave, right? And you can see in some of these cases, right, like from the ones who are dwelling among you, they weren't kidnapping them. In fact, God condemned that. God said that if you're guilty of man stealing, both the man stealer and the purchaser or whatever, whoever's found in possession of them, were both to be put to death, right? It was a death penalty offense. So this is a special a special exception for prisoners of war from 7 particular tribes, right? And because, to my knowledge, we don't have any of the Nephilim around in the world any longer, right? And it would be very, very obvious if we did, right? These are people that would make, George Mirasan and Yao Ming look short, right? If we had people like that, that would be one thing, but we don't have these giant clans anymore. And so this is a thing of the past, right? It's over, it's done with. And so you can't have that anymore. And so the most that you could have is debt slavery, right? So that is one area where I would definitely, I think I differ from at least one, if not both, Joel and Jonathan on that, but it's possible that they might agree with me on that, maybe with some additional nuance. All right. But so this is why the Bible has that in there. But they're talking about the legacy of the South and, this embarrassment of, basically just being white and, Western or white and American because of this, right? And how, there's a lot more to it than that. In fact, I want to show you from Isaiah 56, where God says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate from me from his people," right? And he goes on to say, "And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And then it goes on to say, "The Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, declares, I will gather yet others to him besides those already gathered," right? So God's making it very clear that through a number of ways, and ultimately that's looking forward to the Great Commission and the gospel, grafting in the Gentiles, right? So that the Gentiles are grafted into the branch, and they are now the Israel of God, the New Jerusalem or heavenly Jerusalem, right? So anyhow, let's get back to the interview, because we kind of strayed from that a little bit, but I really did want to get into the slavery laws, because I think that is something critical to understand, right? But let's get back into this, because really this is talking about people's feelings on things like racism and like embarrassment over U.S. Southern slavery.
Things that are extremely against our modern views on equality and really egalitarianism, I suppose. And then when it comes,
Okay, so I'm going to stop real quick again, and just in case it wasn't clear before, but he's talking about there's things in the Bible that talk about hierarchy, both Old and New Testament. Not only talk about hierarchy and how God ordains it, but it even talks about how things are to be ordered and dealt with in terms of dealing with slaves, as an example, right? And whether it be a debt servant and a temporary arrangement, or whether it be the other, arrangement dealing with like the Nephilim tribes that I mentioned before. Either way, you you have God acknowledging that not everybody is equal, right? You see this in other ways in the New Testament where it's very clear, some people, one person might get 10 talents from the Lord, another 5, another 1, right? And then even them, they don't all use them faithfully, right? To whom much is given, much is required, right? But then if you're faithful in little, you'll be faithful in much. And, God talks about the rewards he gives to those who are faithful and diligent, right? So there's all of these ideas woven throughout all of Scripture where it has to do with number one, what we're given and what we're blessed with, but also what we do with it and how well we use it. So there's no real idea of this like egalitarian form of equality. There's an equality that we're all human beings. We're all made in the image and likeness of God, and that's true. But you can't conflate that to say, oh, well, therefore there's no more rank, there's no more distinction between men and women, the only place that matters is as it pertains to salvation and just basically being human. Everything else has rank and distinctions there. They're made by God, they're acknowledged by God, and they're good. And they're even commanded by God, and they're all throughout not only the Old, but the New Testament. And so we have the obligation of recognizing such distinctions.
the 19th century, there's a reframing where they try to take the abolitionists of the Northeast and say that they are the true authentic Christians. So we can kind of save Christianity here. We can show that Christianity is actually a positive force because it's just been misunderstood. In the South, that wasn't real Christianity. And oftentimes the Frederick Douglass quote about the authentic Christianity not being existing or being attached to people who were involved in slavery gets brought up, and the real Christians are those in the North who want to free these slaves. And so it's a cartoon, really, if you actually dig into the primary sources and try to understand what the political context was.
Okay, so what Jonathan Harris is getting at here is he's wanting people to be historically literate and historically accurate, right? It doesn't do us any good if we make these cartoons, as he says, or caricatures, right? It doesn't, to make essentially a comic book out of history where instead of looking at things for what they were, trying to understand the people, their situation, the words that they said, like actually trying to really do the best that we can to truly understand them and what they said and did, right? And it's not as a means of excusing it. It's not as a means of ignoring it, right? And it's not as a means of necessarily praising it. It's just to look at everything honestly, right? Don't buy some narrative by some, woke liberal or, from the 1619 project or something like that and believe half truths and lies about, your ancestors, about your fellow countrymen, about the history of this nation or the history of Christendom. They don't ground things in truth. And then when you get even further out to just the average populace, people believe ridiculous things about our ancestors, and about Christendom, right? Which is, both of those things we should care about, but Christendom is clearly the thing that we should care more of. And, that is something also ordained by God, and it was a good thing. It was a force for good, right? And we don't have to go apologizing and making excuses for these people, but we should seek to understand what was actually going on and then correct inaccuracies. You're not a slavery apologist or whatever, or a white supremacist because you say, no, you know what, we need to do a little bit more critical thinking and like actual accurate evaluation of people, like whether it be Stonewall Jackson or whether it be Frederick Douglass, right? We don't automatically, give sainthood to one guy and his word is as good as the gospel just because of the, color of his skin or where he lived or whatever, what side of the fence he was on. And we don't demonize people for the same type of reasons, right?
Or when it comes to the question of slavery, we try to frame it historically and show that the abolitionists were not on solid biblical footing for what they were trying to do, and it actually led to a lot of negative consequences for our country, and it poisoned race relations, the way the slaves were freed, and the consequences of many of them dying.
Okay, I'm just going to pause this briefly. All of this is saying, the abolitionists who came in, and I will say I do think I see something subtle in this video. If any of you have watched the interview going on between Joel and Jonathan, maybe I'll get into later, but the idea that race relations were poisoned, right? So this was on both sides, by the way. The race relations were poisoned because of what happened, and it's because these were people who weren't ready to be free in some cases, that were impoverished. They were cast out on their own. There was massive problems, as Jonathan will go into a little bit anyhow, and this was all brought on by some men from the North who were abolitionists, who were not necessarily going through things meticulously and biblically in all matters. In fact, some of them are arguably not Christians, right? So even though many times it's professed they were, and certainly at the very least they reasoned from the Bible because they knew that's how they had to reason to a group of moral and virtuous people who were Christians, right?
And living in a war-torn region and being dependent on the government and all these things. That doesn't mean that the society was intrinsically, fundamentally bad and, on this level of, Holocaust, which is basically what the post-war consensus basically made the Holocaust the worst thing ever. And now we're roping in all these other things. Slavery is just another Holocaust. It happened in the United States. MAGA anti-immigration is now apparently another Holocaust. And so it's like this moral play that they keep doing. And I just don't want to let them do it. So...
Okay. So to some degree, I agree with Jonathan Harris here. I do think that there are some atrocities that have happened in the world, and sometimes it's important to bring them up to warn us of others. And this is part of where I disagree with Jonathan a little bit. So abortion is just a shameful evil that should be purged from our nation. It should be immediately purged from our nation. We shouldn't pussyfoot around with it. We don't have any of the. By the way, he's not arguing specifically against criminalizing abortion. I want to make that clear. Although I do think he might be giving a nod to the incrementalists and not wanting absolute abolition of abortion, but all of the things that he's alluding to that were problems with the South regarding the abolition of slavery would not be issues at all with the abolition of abortion. The only thing you might be able to create a case for is because we have such a wicked and unjust system that, having a righteous penalty for it would be next to impossible because of the corruption in the system. Right. You'd either let off people who deserve the death penalty, or people would be condemned unjustly. And our nation likes to do that a lot. In fact, they might possibly use that kind of thing to, find a way to persecute people. And I'm not saying, see, the big scare tactic from someone like, say, a Kamala Harris or whatever, the lie that they tell is that, all these pro-life people, they want to go find, women who had miscarriages and persecute them and prosecute them and put them in prison, put them to death, whatever. No, that's a lie. You should reject that. In fact, you should tell everyone to reject that. However, Kamala Harris is the exact type of person who would do that. The Biden Department of Justice, quote unquote justice, right? They would be the type of people that would do that, right? They are the wicked ones who want to pervert the law and want to oppress people and do not have equal weights and measures, right? So, but anyhow, yeah, Jonathan Harris points that out, and then he does talk a little bit later in the video about the idea of, well, when you have Karen Swallow Prior and all these woke liberals and whatnot saying that climate change is a pro-life issue, and if you don't vote for all these climate change policies and don't support them, then you're a hypocrite and have no right to call yourself pro-life, and all this stupidity, right? All this, I will say it, left-wing stupidity. These people have bought into a narrative. The sad thing is, right, I do feel bad for a large number of these people, but the younger ones, even though as adults, they're, that sympathy starts to wane because they're responsible to educate themselves, right? But they have been brainwashed and fed propaganda for close to 20 years, right? In some cases, probably more like 20, 25, 30 years. But the ones that are, just coming out of high school or they're still in high school, 15 to 20 years of brainwashing, right? Propaganda, lies. And so, and manipulation of things like the Holocaust and slavery for foolish things such as, climate change or whatever, when it should be putting a bullseye right on abortion to eliminate that and eradicate that from our nation entirely, right? It shouldn't even be named here. We should be more ashamed and embarrassed of that than we ever have been of slavery, than any German has been of the Holocaust. There is nothing in the history of the world, save for the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ, that is a more shameful event or series of events than abortion is here in the U.S.
Who had really, ultimately, if you want to trace the supply chain back, they had received their slaves. They had bought their slaves from northeastern merchants primarily. They didn't get compensation. There was no integration into society. The constitutions and laws in many northern states prohibited black people from certain civil rights. They couldn't even, in some places, live in those regions. They had to contain it in the South, and they didn't want them in the Western territories. So the South is supposed to free all these slaves who aren't necessarily all ready to take care of themselves, and they're supposed to just bear the cost of this.
Okay, so I want you to hear what he's saying, because there's some people who will try to make hay on this in a really wicked way. But basically, what he's saying, it's like if the police sold a bunch of heroin to people. No, I'm not trying to talk about actual U.S. history here or anything, but it's like if the police sold heroin to a group of people and then said, we're going to come in, we're going to arrest you, and we might let you bail yourselves out, right? But we're not going to pay you back any of the money for the heroin that we sold you, right? Whether it be our police or anyone else, right? Nobody else is going to bear the cost. Nobody's going to reimburse you. We did this wicked thing, but we're going to be all good. You're going to pay for it. And by the way, right, when your people come out because they can't work there are other places where they theoretically could go and thrive or make a living, but we're not going to allow them to go there either, right? So you guys are going to wallow in this problem that we at least participated in creating for you, right? And I know, I could be oversimplifying it here a little bit, but the idea is there's a lot more to it than people want to admit, right? And for this reason, I think it was very bold and courageous and manly or whatever for these two guys to talk about this, right? Because obviously they're going to get a lot of hate. There's going to be a lot of people who are not capable of thinking clearly or critically, who are just going to malign them and revile them and hate them. And like I've even said already, there's I opened up the whole podcast with something where I thought they either dropped the ball or I disagreed with them on, right? So my disagreements aren't being kept secret here. But I just think they're closer to being right, and they're more virtuous for the type of conversation that they're having than the people are who just want to malign them and believe the left-wing narrative, right? Those are the foolish people.
And the South said, no, that's not a good deal. And so I think that's on a broad level, what people have to understand about this. It's not that those in the South who were fighting for the Confederacy that's fighting for the perpetuation of slavery or slavery in the abstract. Most of them, I would say, were gradual emancipationists of some stripe. They wanted to get rid of the institution. And there's some proof I can go through if you want to know more about that. But they just weren't radical abolitionists that saw a one-size-fits-all solution to immediately abolish without compensation and integration. So that's at the time.
Okay, so real quick, the integration is the idea that Black people would be able to move to the west, the westward expansion, be able to move to the north, and so forth, and that they would be able to be productive members of society there. That it wasn't a matter of, okay, you have all of this expense, which was the other thing. Again, the North was selling these slaves and was participating in this trade, but yet wants the only payment, the whole burden of this to be on the South, right? So, in that regard, it is demonstrably wrong. And I think the people who try to make hay on this are going to try to make you think, oh, well, those poor slave owners, that the Bible says they should be put to death, but these guys think that they should be compensated, right? Again, I think it's a lot more than that. Also, you have people who didn't go to enslave anyone. The people that were in their household were not even people. They didn't purchase them. They didn't capture them. These were people that they grew up on a place where maybe, you might be talking 3 or 4 generations deep or more, right? You could be talking 6 or 8 generations deep, where these were households who, they interacted and they did have natural affections. Were there abuses, and, were there places where it was harsh and brutal and cruel, and, all of the things that rightly deserve our scorn? Of course, there were places like that, right? Nobody's trying to say that those places didn't exist and that nothing like that ever happened. We're trying to say that that wasn't endemic and characteristic of absolutely every interaction, right? So again, it's just important to look at things historically, to think through all of the actions, all of the repercussions and nuances, right? Yes, keep your principles clear, right? Keep your principles clear. There were definitely people who deserved the death penalty through that. In fact, the Africans on the Ivory Coast, which I think I'm going to show you a clip of that here shortly. And the Muslims and whatnot who had these slave blocks where they kidnapped these people from these tribes. Generally speaking, they should be put to death. Now, is there a possibility that there was, a war where, the people who ended up winning were the ones who were attacked, and and as a way of not destroying the other tribe, they enslaved them and sold them? That's possible. I don't know that. That was actually something basically similar to that was speculated on this episode, on this show. When I'm saying that, I mean between Joel Webbon and Jonathan Harris. And I think that we just have to look at the things that we don't know and admit that we don't know them, and therefore we can't issue broad brush condemnations on people and situations that we know nothing about. The things that may have happened, or at least in certain cases definitely did happen, that we know are black and white, we can make black and white declarations on that. All the stuff that happens downstream from that, we have to understand, a few things. One, this was a time period and a group of people that may have had some blind spots, right? But beyond that, a lot of them actually found the slave trade and slavery to be distasteful. We'll get into that. I'll let Jonathan Harris go over some of that, where some of the theologians and well-known leaders and whatnot acted and spoke in ways that are different from what your modern government school history program would teach you, right? And I think all of that we have to take into account, and then just have a real humble and contrite attitude towards our past. We shouldn't be ashamed of our past. We shouldn't be embittered against our past, right? This is a completely different country with completely different people and completely different opportunities that have nothing to do with that. In fact, even though I think it was noble for, the people who fought in the Civil War, I would say that, again, the Civil War is a lot more complicated than we make it out to be, and it wasn't all about slavery or even predominantly about slavery in many or most cases. But it's still, there was a part of it that was, right? And so to that end, there was noble efforts happening, but they were rash and unwise. And, you see, there were things that weren't thought out here. There were, there were places where, the North really took advantage of the South, and they committed horrible crimes and didn't want any of the culpability for that. They didn't want any of the responsibility, the expense of taking care of that, but they wanted to put it on people who were not liable for the entirety of it, right? And so, again, just if you're an American, whether you're white or black or you're of mixed heritage, right? Whether you live in the North or the South, whether your family comes from the North or the South, it doesn't matter, right? It does not matter, right? Those are things, don't get me wrong. It's good to be proud of your ancestors and know who they are and have a sense of belonging and identity. Those are good things, right? Those are blessed things. God actually highly emphasizes that. However, don't be ashamed of your ancestors. Don't be ashamed of your religious Christian heritage. It's the only heritage to be proud of in this whole world, right? But not only that, don't have the self-loathing, like we want to give America and all her people a mercy killing, and we've got to be committed to our own destruction type of mindset, right? So let's go back to the video.
Secession was, by many, considered to be a constitutional right. And we can get into that if you want. There's many reasons for, and legitimate reasons people thought that. But they wanted to respond to Lincoln's force. So you don't see anything about slavery, for example, in Virginia's secession declaration. It's really just a response to Lincoln has called up arms. We're going to join the people who have left because we don't want to live in a country like that. So the war itself was about whether or not a state has the right to secede.
The slave, yeah, sure. The Bible doesn't outright condemn slavery.
Okay. So that clip from Jonathan Harris, I was kind of going into that, but just to emphasize and reiterate that the Civil War was not predominantly about slavery. It was most about the right to secede, right? And honestly, I believe that is a right, and I believe it's a right that exists to this day, right? A state does not have to feel compelled to remain part of the United States, right? Do I like having a country and one that's united? Yes, but honestly, we're more of an empire, and we have shown that we're unwilling to rule righteously. There's always overreach, right? And unequal weights and measures and unjust standards of law outright. We need to, and we're obligated to, base our law off from the strict general equity of the case laws of the Scripture, right? So we can't just say, I think this is somehow upholding life, so therefore I'm good, right? But you actually have to look at the way God ethically chose to deal with different types of situations when you look at the law, and use that and the general equity of that to apply to your situation, right? So, as an example, slavery is a good example, right? We wouldn't have any reason to condemn it. We could not morally and righteously condemn slavery if it wasn't for the law of God. At the same time, we can't condemn things like, indentured servitude, right? That's wrong. God set that up as a means of protection for poor people, especially people that made some unwise decisions. He made it as a vehicle for them to gain skills, connections, good habits and discipline, and all of those things to be furnished from the person that they went under, furnished liberally, and to potentially gain wealth and become a wealthy person. And that was to be perpetuated, right? So we can't condemn that, but we can condemn this kind of man stealing type thing, right? The idea of enslaving a free man just because we want free labor, right? That is wrong. And that's a death penalty offense, right? But in this nation, we have so many wicked laws that oppress so many people, and they're meant to grease the palms of people in one part of the country at the expense of the backs of people in another part of the country, right? You have people that get angry because popular vote doesn't dictate all, which is ridiculous and stupid, right? We don't want mob rule, right? Mob rule will always go to the lowest common denominator. It will always go to injustice, right? It will always go to whatever. It could be an unrighteous promise, like some kind of freebie that people are promised, and they think, oh, well, I have the right to steal from these other people and try to force them to have to give that to me because we have more people over here, right? That's wrong, right? That's basically like a gang fight, right? But in a republic, right, a constitutional republic or democratic republic, again, we'll get into in another episode the way nations are set up, but the idea is that every group has representation, and so nobody gets steamrolled, right? And so even having like an electoral college, right? When you look at the map of what are the areas that voted for Trump, right? If you just look at it based on the geography of the map and not saying, well, in this square mile we have, 5,000 times more people per square mile or whatever it is, right? I'm just pulling that number out of thin air. But the idea is, this little itty bitty dot, this region, right? Just because they have more people shouldn't dictate what goes on for an entire country that would take, 3 full days plus to drive through, right? At a decent rate of speed on a highway, right? That a nation that big, right? And that's just the contiguous US. That's not even talking about Alaska, which is about 50% the time of that, right? So like you if you count Alaska and Hawaii and all that, you're talking, it would, if you lined them all up and put a highway straight through, it would take almost a week driving at like 65, 70 miles an hour to get through the whole thing, right? And you're thinking that one little blip on the map, one little city should be able to dictate how everybody has to live and spend their money in all of those other places. Are you kidding me? That is wicked, right? But this is the mind games that they play with you. They think that, because people who live in cities are just accustomed to cities and city thinking, right? And they have no clue. They have no clue what life would be like, say in Nebraska, right? In the more rural areas of Nebraska. They have no clue what life is like in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or northern Maine. They have no clue what life is like in the Texas Panhandle or something like that, right? They just don't know. They're clueless, right? And so there needs to be a representation for those people. They can't be steamrolled like that. The other thing is, if we were ruling justly and organizing our government justly and patterning our laws after God's law very strictly, a lot of these issues wouldn't pop up. You may have some, but most of them would be resolved.
But the slave trade that occurred in America, the transatlantic slave trade, was condemned outright by Scripture because Scripture condemns man stealing, kidnapping.
Right, and I think I accept the general premise here that you're mainly sourcing the slaves from the Ivory Coast, because the slave markets were already set up there. And that's where there's tribal warfare going on. And it's Africans who are selling Africans into slavery to Europeans and also to Muslims. So these markets were already there. It wasn't that the Europeans went and formed them, which is an important point probably to bring up. But
okay, so I'm jumping through a couple of things here. So they're going on a discourse about biblical law regarding slavery, the actual history of these slave trades, where the slaves come from, who set it up, who was buying them, and and where over the generations a slave who was purchased might find themselves and what their life might have changed to be like, and so there's a number of things that they were covering here, right? Joel Webbon is trying to make the case that, once you get past the first transaction, right, where, okay, the person who kidnapped them should get the death penalty. The person who purchased them knowingly, like if they knowingly purchased a slave, which I don't see how you couldn't, but, let's just say for the sake of argument that there may be certain circumstances that are very periphery that might have happened where somebody wouldn't have committed a death penalty offense, right? The majority of those men definitely deserve the death penalty. Joel's argument, and I'm not going to say that I completely agree with it, especially not as presented in that video. But his argument is like, oh well, what do you do 4 generations from now when, a young man inherits these slaves, right? In other words, he shouldn't be executed. Now, I do agree with him on that. That young man didn't create any of these circumstances, so he shouldn't receive the death penalty. So then the question becomes, well, what do you do with that? Which is the other thing that they were kind of throwing back and forth. And they were saying that, the South was trying to hash that out of what do we do with these people that are here. Keep in mind that slavery existed before the U.S. was officially a independent nation, right? It's not the narrative that the liberals want to say, which is the whole nation's credited to black slaves, as if there were no white slaves that were. But the whole nation is credited to them, and the whole nation was built on their backs. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have this nation. That's not true. That's simply not true. Now, it is true that certain places may have thrived at one point in time more because of that, and that would be unjust, right? But again, you have to have a much more complex way of looking at it. Is the point?
It wasn't strictly based on race. You did have white slaves, and oftentimes we refer to them as indentured servants. In fact, those who came over from Africa on the Dutch ship in 1619, the black ones even, were probably indentured servants most likely. But they were treated oftentimes horribly, even if they were white. And I remember there's an antebellum house in Lynchburg when I lived there, and on their record, and on their rolls, they have listed some white slaves. And so there were some, and there were many, there was thousands of black people. Well, I think I'm not off base saying thousands. So there are at least hundreds of black slave owners as well. So who participated in this, who got out of slavery or bought their freedom. There were sometimes mechanisms for them to do this, and then they became slave owners, and sometimes very successful large slave owners. So it's a little more nuanced than that to say it's just strictly based on race, or
All right, that's one of the bigger things that I wanted to get into, other than just God's law on the subject, is that just like you had black and brown Muslims who were operating some of these slave blocks, and definitely who were purchasing slaves, not only from Africa, but also from, lands that were predominantly white, right? The Barbary slave trade, right? So this idea that, it was just black people and it was just about race and it was just white people purchasing black people and then mistreating them or whatnot, that is a grossly oversimplified way of looking at it, to the point of being reckless and irresponsible and just simply fallacious, right? Just wrong. And so we need to look at this a little bit differently. People will talk about reparations, but what about the people who were black who owned slaves, right? It's not reasonable. Also, the idea that if you look at families, Jonathan Harris mentioned. I don't know if I have this in the clip or not, so I'll just mention it now. Of families, entire families, maybe 15% owned slaves, but of the actual population, only about 5% of the population, of the white population, owned slaves in the South. And so now you're asking the descendants of the other 95% to pay for the sins or crimes of the other 5%, and that is after already having a reckless and ahistorical look at the subject, where we're not even considering the facts. So it's just a completely unjust way of looking at things. You just can't look at things like that. That's really, that's talking about people who have more of like a desire for vengeance themselves, right? Or vigilantism or those kind of things, as opposed to people who actually want to see justice done.
Famously, Stonewall Jackson taught slaves to read the Bible anyway, and it was just something that they didn't really enforce.
Okay, so he's talking about, this is a different part where they're talking about how there were anti-literacy laws that were being ignored and not upheld, and the anti-literacy laws were only put in place so that way some of the more incendiary abolitionist literature coming from the North wouldn't cause violence in the South, right? But as Jonathan Harris is pointing out, that was ignored, and people like Stonewall Jackson were teaching slaves to read.
But they were on the books in many southern states. You also had the fact that the slave trade itself, I think Dabney calls it an iniquitous traffic, and there was even if maybe the northeastern merchants or whoever, European merchants who were bringing slaves over, they weren't maybe doing the kidnapping, but they were relying on tribal peoples in those regions to kidnap, or maybe it was just the result of tribal warfare. It's a little hard to say, but certainly, the beginning of the supply chain wasn't a good thing at all.
I just think of like guys like George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards, or they were like good Christian men. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised, when you get to heaven and, you're spending eternity worshiping Christ next to Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and Jonathan Edwards, and George Whitefield and Martin Luther King Jr. is in hell. Like I was Caldwell's.
Okay, that one's probably going to get some people up in arms. It shouldn't, but it probably will. So Martin Luther King Jr., who for most of the last 50 years has been just lauded and fawned over by the left and the right, and so much so that you have evangelical institutions. You had MLK 50 a few years back, where you had what was it, the Gospel Coalition or Together for the Gospel? One of the two had MLK 50. And it was just a gross mishandling of Scripture to fawn over a man who was a heretic. Not only was he a heretic, but he was a womanizer. He was an adulterer, right? Did some horrible, despicable things, and approved of even more horrible and despicable things, right? And he was a heretic in the truest sense of the word. He denied the Trinity, right? He denied the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was not a Christian. He was not a Christian unless he repented just before taking his last breath, and you will not expect to see him in heaven, right? But to Joel Webbon's point, there's all these people who get maligned and vilified from the South who are actually good Christian men, even if they had a blind spot for something that was evil, right? They didn't deny the gospel. They didn't deny the Trinity. They didn't deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They taught accurately. They sought to love their neighbor as themselves, which included, in most cases, slaves, right? Like you're going to see here in a minute, Jonathan Harris is going to recount a story of a former slave from the perspective of the former slave and a family member of his, right, who did not own slaves, by the way. But you're going to hear about that, and it doesn't go with the common liberal narrative, right? We have to kill and drop that narrative. It's not accurate. It's not good. It's not helpful. And we have to help other people who are caught up under it, right? We have to help them kind of be liberated from it, have the veil taken off from their eyes, right? So there's going to be people that, your government school history teacher who probably doesn't know history any better than you did before you got into that class. There's going to be people that they maligned that you're going to see in heaven, and there's going to be people that they fawned over that you're going to find out went to hell, right?
Age of entitlement.
The age of entitlement, and the Civil Rights Act, you can't get rid of the Constitution. So what do you do instead? Well, you create a de facto Constitution, and you don't get rid of the true Constitution because that's too obvious and people would revolt. So what you do is it's like a glass case of this de facto Constitution. You put it over the actual Constitution. So the actual Constitution no longer is a hedge or a protection or a defense or even a threat to your progressive agenda, because every time somebody defers to the Constitution, it will be viewed through this, this progressive lens, in the Civil Rights Act and blah, 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 blah.
So that skipped to another subject where Joel started talking about the Civil Rights Act, right? And how people, even if, and some of them were definitely malicious, but even if they were well-meaning, right? You have this Civil Rights Act that is meant to essentially be a hedge against the Constitution, instead of the Constitution being a hedge for us, where instead of having our liberties protected, right? And largely not having the government, try to dictate our lives, and not having them force a particular agenda, especially one that is antichrist, right? Antichrist means evil, right? For if you happen to be an unbeliever and you're listening to this and considering what I'm saying, forget about all the other stuff being said. If you have a group that wants to push forth rampant sodomy, and you have a group that wants to push forth abortion on demand, any kind of abortion at all, right? Sacrificing your children to Molech, that's wicked. It's evil. It's unconscionable, right? If they want to dictate whether or not a person can work to provide for their own family, right? That is evil, wicked, unconscionable, right? We can get into all these other things, but at the baseline, right, there are certain inalienable rights that God has given to his people, and the government is not the source of our rights, and they don't have the right or authority to take them away, right? Only God does. God dictates and demands and determines exactly when, how, and where we get rights, and if there's ever a point where we lose them, right? And so we need to be beholden to God and his standards, and not basically the whims of man, right? So,
well, Dabney did address that in a defense of Virginia, and I mean, in the debate that I just referenced with Jay Blanchard, also it came up, and they essentially say that this is. You look at the Greco-Roman slave system, it has many abuses, it's horrible. What does Paul say? What does Jesus say? Jesus gives parables that include slavery, and he doesn't denounce it. He even talks about many lashes. In one of his parables, he says that the slave who doesn't follow essentially what his master told him will receive many lashes. It's like, what? Jesus said that? Yeah, he did. Paul talks about.
I will say that the master in question is in the parable would be God, right? But it's true. Now you can look at that as Jesus relating for something that would be understandable and common to them in a Roman culture. Or you could look at that and say, well, Jesus clearly isn't condemning, every instance where this happens. So there must be some way where at least some of this can comport with the law of God, and maybe some of it doesn't, right? And you have to do some thinking there, right? And my purpose here isn't to go into that right now, but my purpose here is to say, we've got to change the way we think about things, right? This isn't saying bring back chattel slavery. No, in fact, it's the exact opposite of that. I think people should die. They should be put to death for going and stealing people, right? Should indentured servitude be allowed again with certain parameters? Absolutely, right? But the biggest point here is to stop talking about people in our past and be manipulated to distance ourselves from our Christian heritage simply because, the word slavery is used. We can't allow the word slavery to immediately be like a trump card. It's not the the Uno wild card, right? Or whatever. They don't clear the field as soon as they spout the word racism. You have to be able to, or slavery, right? You can't be manipulated like that. And so that's really the point here, is to say, hey, let's think these things through critically. Let's think them through biblically. Let's understand what Jesus said and what God said through Paul and others, and why.
About the responsibilities of slaveholders many times. In fact, there's a whole book, Philemon, which the reason I brought up the story of Booker T. Washington and his family crying when they were just been misunderstood.
I apologize. I messed that up again, but he's about to go into this story about Booker T. Washington and a family member of his.
There's in one of his parables, he says that the slave who doesn't follow essentially what his master told him will receive many lashes. It's like, what? Jesus said that? Yeah, he did. Paul talks about the responsibilities of slaveholders many times. In fact, there's a whole book, Philemon, which the reason I brought up the story of Booker T. Washington and his family crying when they were freed with the plantation owners is because there was this mutual love that often took place and happened. It's a reality. And you can see it with the slave narratives. You can see it with foreign observers and what they saw. You can see it with even Census Bureau data, which shows that families seem to thrive in the South, slave families, more than free blacks in the North. And so all this stuff paints a picture that's very different than the picture that we have. And I'll tell you a story about my grandfather. He died this year at 101 years old. When he was a child growing up in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, that's my Confederate connection, I guess. He was a cotton farmer, and he had a slave, ex-slave who lived down the road, and an ex-Confederate soldier who lived down the road that he would talk to. This blows your mind that, I knew him and he knew, but the slave that lived down the road told him the story of being captured in Africa and coming to the United States. And he lived in harmony. He was friends with my grandparents' family. Would it have been right or just to take that slave and say, we're shipping you back? We're going to just drop you in Africa somewhere? Obviously not. He had made his life in the United States at that point. And, when you look at slavery itself, John Thornton talks about this in his book, Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World. The supply chain started with Africans in tribal warfare. We don't have records about this. We don't know exactly what happened. Right. We just know that they were sold to Europeans at some point and brought over. But you don't know. It could be that there was a war that happened between tribes that happened all the time, and it wasn't the exact kind of kidnapping the Bible mentions. Right. There's a lot of ignorance about this. The point is, downstream from it, what do you do with real, tangible people with real, tangible needs, and who have connections that they've developed in this country? And
this, real quick, just to interject, John, this is where you made me think about it, and I've been thinking the whole hour we've been talking, so I got to get it out. But this is one of the problems with some of like the modern theonomist guys. Who, I'm a general equity theonomist. I love those brothers, but like as they speak about slavery and those kinds of, this is what I've realized is the operating default assumption. Is they're going to say, because Israel, there were particular guidelines if you had your own Hebrew brother as a slave, but as it pertained to the other nations, like if you had a slave from Assyria or a slave from Babylon or a slave for whatever from pagan nations, here's the deal. A lot of even and I'm talking about the conservative Christians today, theonomists being one of them, they operate underneath this assumption that the only foreign slaves that Israel ever owned, that every single one of them was initially put into slavery because of financial debt.
Oh, yeah, no.
Okay, so that's incorrect statement from Joel. Most theonomists do not believe that. Sometimes I wonder, it's very interesting, the places where people kind of hang out on the internet or whatnot. Like if you're on certain parts of X, Twitter, um, if you're there, you might have a different perception than if you're on certain parts of Facebook, and, so forth. Um, but the majority of theonomists do not believe that all of the slaves from other nations, as in non-Hebrews, were there because of debt. Most theonomists know that they were there either because of war, or the people's basically cutting a deal and selling themselves as slaves so they didn't have to be destroyed. However, he's also wrong, in my estimation, about, you couldn't take a perpetual slave from just anywhere, right? If Israel had decided to go on a campaign and go invade Ethiopia or India, they would not have been able to take slaves and hold them in perpetuity, right? So in that regard, he is wrong, right? Unless I misunderstood that last comment he made, he'd be wrong about that. But just kind of trying to wrap this up and tie the loose threads together. Some of the things that I wanted to talk about were, number one, we can't just ham-fistedly label everything as racism and assume that we know all about it and that we don't have to actually understand the situation to make a righteous judgment. No, we don't. Jesus says in John chapter 7, do not judge based on appearances, but rather judge a right judgment. We're commanded to do this over and over again, to have the facts, to hear both sides of the story, to vet both sides of the story, right? And then make a decision. Like if you're going to decide something negatively about someone, to assume negatively or conclude negatively, you have to have the facts. Otherwise, your obligation to Jesus, not even just that person, right? Your obligation to King Jesus, God's ordained obligation to himself, right, is that you assume positively about everyone in everything, or you seek to get your facts so that you can make a righteous judgment. But you can't just go assuming negative about every single person, right? Like, or even just specific groups of people that's expedient for you, right? And number two, whether the word slavery gets thrown around or the word racism, again, those are things to wade through all of the nuances. You can't, with a broad brushstroke, paint all of the people, right? You'd have to condemn blacks and whites. You'd have to condemn innocent and guilty. All of these different people, right? So don't let that be some kind of emotional cudgel that you allow unbelievers to beat you over the head with. Just don't allow it. Don't allow it at all. Refuse to engage in that kind of shame mongering, right? They can't shame you, right? When the inspiration for doing this, I did watch this, and I thought about doing a video on it, and initially I wasn't going to, right? But the reason I did this is because I watched a couple other videos criticizing Joel specifically. And they were focusing on another sermon that I've also listened to from him, and misrepresented it badly, as well as a number of other things that he said. And they do so basically because they can't actually deal with his arguments, or if they do, they just dismiss them. But what they want to do is they want to take that emotional cudgel, the word racism, right? And they want to take those kind of things that people viscerally, emotionally react to, and use them as a weapon to try to attack these people. And that what they want you to do is they want you to condemn them and demonize them, and especially to dismiss them. Because if you dismiss them, you won't listen to or think about what they actually say. So don't allow them that kind of power over you. Like, listen, look, read through the Bible, think for yourself, like really try to understand the point being made, and then really try to understand what the Bible is saying and see if what they say is true, right? If it is true, if you look at the Bible and the Bible truly affirms that. Now, if it doesn't, then you should reject what they say. right? You see me here, I don't accept everything that they say, right? But I don't reject everything offhand either. In fact, like I said, more often than not, these two men are right about things, right? But there are some enemies who will say, "Oh, this guy teaches racism. His teachings wind up in racism." He will talk about instituting a just society based on the fact that as Christians, the blood of Christ that has purchased us also gives us um, a unique qualification to be capable of righteously ruling, right? And that's not even every Christian, right? It's specific Christians who meet the biblical qualifications, which God ensures whether or not they meet, right? But the point is, right, that you have these other people who will sit there and they'll clutch their pearls and they'll go like that, and oh my goodness, what he's saying must be, like blood and soil, right? It must be some kind of racism, some horrible um, fascist dictatorship, some iron-fisted tyranny, right? Which is literally the exact polar opposite of anything that he's bringing up. These are just people who, in many cases, they're ignorant. Some cases they just act kind of limp-wristed, and anything that looks like decency and order and justice, they just want to spurn and get rid of, right? We don't want to be like that. But the last thing I wanted to bring up is this whole idea of kinism. And because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's kind of like the idea of um, that there are, you're supposed to keep your bloodline pure, right? Like this is your ethnic bloodline. We're not talking about your spiritual bloodline, but your ethnic bloodline. And you shouldn't have what some people would call quote unquote interracial marriages, or like inter-ethnic marriages, mixed marriages, or whatever. And they would, the more extreme kinist would, um, affirm any kind of slavery, including chattel slavery. The more extreme kinist, and when I say that, I don't just mean trying to work through and say, like, is there anything that could be not condemned, right, righteously? Anything we're not supposed to condemn. But these are guys that just like wholesale take it all. I even heard one guy, and I'm just going to say it's one guy. I'm not going to say it's the whole movement, right? That's ham-fisted. We don't do that. But this one guy was trying to say that you could say that there's ethnic superiority, right? That now, if you said cultural superiority, right, I would agree. Christian culture is clearly superior. It has educated people of all ethnicities, right? It has brought prosperity and blessing and healing to people of all ethnicities. It's brought justice and truth to people of all ethnicities. It's brought civilization to people of all ethnicities, right? Hospitals, mathematics, science, all of these things were driven by the Christian faith, right? Even the Muslims who try to claim that they can take ownership of some of this stuff, you end up finding out that they went and in the Islamic conquest, they took over like a Christian land, and they threatened to kill a guy. Maybe his name was John Smith or something, and then all of a sudden he's Muhammad Abu Bakr, right? And Muhammad Abu Bakr is given credit with some type of scientific or mathematical discovery. That's really like the overwhelming majority of their contribution, is when they went to take a claim of the work Christians had already done based on a Christian worldview, right? And that's just fact, right? That's just fact. Christianity is what brings us things like traffic lights and seat belts and sidewalks, right? Christianity is what will cause us to, not abuse our animals and mistreat them, to not malnourish them, right? To not completely deplete an entire population of animals out of short-term greed and gluttony, right? Christianity is what teaches us that somebody should be able to walk into a hospital and be healed, regardless of whether or not we know if they can pay, right? Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily get it for free, but it does mean that they're not refused care, right? Christianity is what tells us that another human life has value, intrinsic value, right? Why you can't go and murder someone, why something like the Holocaust would have been wrong, right? Why John Wayne Gacy was wrong for what he did, right? Christianity is what tells us that child molestation is wrong, and why there would even be a scandal in the first place if someone even within the church was guilty of it, right? Why that becomes scandalous and shameful, and people get upset. The fact that you have things that make you morally indignant is because Christianity is true, right? And so it's a superior culture, right? But there is no superior amount of melanin, right? Whether you say a small amount or a high amount, right? There is no law or principle that is against inter-ethnic marriages. I'm entering into an inter-ethnic marriage very soon, in fact. By God's grace, He's brought to my life a wonderful woman who is going to be, she's godly, she's going to be a great helper, and I'm looking forward to that. I'm excited about that. I can't wait to share some of that with you. And so obviously, I don't believe that that's wrong, right? But I will say that when you marry between cultures, and I'm not even getting the full amount of this yet, but I can already see I'm already working through things, and fortunately, my soon-to-be bride, right? She is also like mindful of things, and we talk about things because when you marry between cultures, there's all kinds of things to work out, right? And so if someone says, "Oh, well, it might not be ideal to marry someone from a completely different ethnicity, a completely different culture," right? The idea shouldn't be to think, "Oh, they're automatically a racist." No, most of the time they're probably not. Some of them might be, sure, right? But they're probably not. Really, what they're saying is there's a lot of things that you don't think about that um, it can be things like, oh, this culture, we follow the biblical pattern of the wife being named after her husband and her husband alone. She no longer carries her father's name, right? And in another culture, she might either carry her father's name and her husband's name, or she might carry her mother's family's name, right? And so, you would have to work that out. She would have to, agree, hey, the biblical pattern is that the woman is named after her husband, right? Her identity is tied up in his family name, right? And so she would have to, be willing to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of tension. You're going to have problems in the family. It's going to bother one of you or the other or both, right? It's going to cause an issue, right? There could be things like, I don't know, how you honor the Sabbath, right? That can be a cultural difference, right? That's going to be a big deal in a Christian family, right? You can look at, does this culture have women that do not in any way, shape, or form act as a pastor? They're not doing the doctrinal teaching. They don't have authority over anyone. They're not trying to be seen as a leader of the congregation, but they're called, a pastora, right? Like, it's like the pastor's wife, right? But the word pastor is kind of applied there, right? Well, those are things to work out, right? When you hear that, that could be really surprising to people, right? And there's literally 100 things dealing with clothing, with food, with the way you clean things, with the way you organize things. Time is a huge one, right? Do you show up to things on time? Do you show up early? Or is it okay and considered acceptable to show up anywhere from 45 minutes to 3 or 4 hours late? Right? That's a big, big deal, right? Like, and you look at some cultures, right? Even a wedding, they might have a problem showing up on time, right? In other cultures, a wedding, if everybody isn't early, they're late, right? And so, again, you gotta work those kind of things out. When does church start in that type of a context, right? What about Bible studies? What about anything? Birthday party. You pick a woman up for a date, for goodness sakes. If you have that, when do you show up to work, right? Do you have to be there right on time, right? Do you have to be there early, or is it okay to go into work 10 or 15 minutes late, right? And even in a culture where, you know, that's unacceptable, right? The company might consider it acceptable, or vice versa, right? And so you have to, all these culture issues you have to work out, right? And so if you hear somebody encouraging someone to marry someone that is of their own culture, right? That's not like some kind of big code for they're a white supremacist or whatever, they're a racist, right? They're just really um, they're thinking through things realistically and all the challenges that there are, right? Some of the challenges that they mention, I might reject as saying, "Oh, you shouldn't worry about that," right? But a lot of them are real, right? I used to have this woman that she volunteered at a ministry that I used to volunteer for, and I was kind of one of the leaders of. And she used to say, "Oh, Jeremy, we've got to find you a good white woman," right? And she's a black lady, and she's like, "We got to find me a good black man," right? That wasn't just her way of saying she wasn't interested, right? Because I wasn't interested in her, and we both would have known that immediately, right? But the point was, she as a value believed, hey, there's going to be reasons why these guys are going to be a lot closer to me in terms of their culture and their expectations, and so that's the type of man I should marry, right? Number one, because she might want to perpetuate aspects of that culture, right? But number two, it's gonna have fewer causes for stumbling, fewer causes for offense, right? And she wanted the same thing for me, right? That's all it was. It wasn't her thinking that because she's a black woman that black people are superior, or she wasn't self-loathing saying white people are superior. No, she was just simply looking out for me, right? Now, that doesn't mean I'm taking her advice, right? I don't think she was right. And that was a long time ago, too. But the point is, right, you see it in all kinds of different cultures, and it's not all this wicked, horrible thing. Sometimes it's, honest and well meaning, and even may have some wisdom that you should heed, right? Um, a white man in Atlanta, Georgia, in a Reformed Baptist church, is going to have a lot more in common with a black woman in Atlanta, Georgia, in a Reformed Baptist church than he is going to be with, a woman from China, or a woman from Ethiopia, you know, or even a woman from South Africa, right? I mean, maybe a little bit more, especially if she's either white or Anglicanized in some way, right? But there's just cultural differences, right? If you look at, if you're going to go into, say, Chile, right, or Paraguay or something to try to find a wife, you might find a wife there. You might find a wonderful wife there, right? Um, but she's going to be a lot more different than a woman that sits in your own congregation, right? So if you have women that might be suitable in your own congregation, or if you're a young woman listening to this and there's a man there, you want to think about that. Those are real things, right? If you marry someone from Germany, guess what? There's a lot of things where they're similar to us, right? But homeschooling is outlawed there, right? They're accustomed, most of the people there, to thinking that your kids have to go to a government school, right? That might be a hard adjustment for them. It might mean their expectations change. They certainly aren't people who are automatically going to know how to do it, right? So just, again, all kinds of things to think about. So that's going to be it for this episode. I really hope it was a blessing to you. Please, if you have pushback, if you disagree, even if you want to encourage us, make sure you leave a note in the comments section. We really appreciate that, no matter where you're coming from. We appreciate your feedback, and I want to hear from you. Also, if you would prayerfully consider donating to this ministry, I'm going to leave a link in the comments section, in the description, in the description. And then if this was a blessing to you, please smash that like button. Make sure to share it with your friends. And if you really didn't care for it, you can smash on that thumbs down button twice. But until next time, God bless.